The Holy Gospel according to St. John, the first chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. And what has come into being in him was life, and life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become the children of God, who were born not of blood or the will of flesh or the will of a man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. The gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
You may be seated. Well, one of the most important questions that we answer as God's people is, who is God? What is our understanding of God? Because our understanding of God will define our relationship, how we relate to God, what we expect from God, how that all works out, how we live our lives is then going to be shaped to some degree by who God is. So I want you to take a second and come up with a word or a phrase, your first word or phrase for who God is for you. And it's a word or a phrase, who is God for you? Well, when I answer that question myself, my go-to one is always God is love. Of course, love is a great big word, has all kinds of different meanings, so we could spend a lot of time packing that. But I don't want to spend some time there, because I think we all have some of those answers in our head that are good answers for who God is in our heads. They're up there, and they work for us a lot of the time, but not all the time. I don't know about you, but my soul I find is a little more complex than just to believe one thing. In fact, what I say happens to me is I kind of have these default settings, if you will. That when my learned or even better thoughtful answers don't work, I go to a different understanding of God, a default setting, if you will, a fallback place that I've learned, absorbed, that fits my some parts of my personality, if you will, that function well. And so I want to talk about a couple of those today, a couple of default settings. And the first one, I believe, is that we tend to want God to like what we like. You know, in the Genesis text, of course, right at the beginning there, it says, God created us in the image of God. But I think our tendency is to want to create God in our image, to project who we are up in the heavens, and that's who God's going to be for us. And I think that's one of those default setting things. So I'll give you some examples, particularly around values, that say, for instance, you know, our country is very big on self-sufficiency, that we should all be, you know, independent, self-sufficient people. And that shows up in that a huge percentage of Christians believe that the verse, God helps those who help themselves, is in the Bible. That this great big bunch, have you all heard that phrase, right? God helps those who help. That's a self-sufficiency thing, isn't it? In other words, you got to go out and help yourself, and, you know, it's on you, and then God will give you a little help. That's a very self-sufficient value. And that's in the Bible. Well, it's not in the Bible. It's a creation, the old phrase that just spun around our self-sufficient culture, and it should be in the Bible. But we do that in lots of different values in terms of how we see our politics, or how we see our economic principles, how we see, most anything. We think, well, God's got to like that, or God's behind that for sure, you know. And that then goes, of course, to make God behind the groups that we like, that God must be for our group, and especially for our group, whatever group that is, family, church, God's for Ascension, right? God's for our country, God's for our political party, whatever it is, God's for us. And I think Isaiah kind of bumps into that one today, saying, you know what, guys? God speaking, my thoughts aren't your thoughts. Let's just start there. My thoughts are not your thoughts. Take a step back. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. That maybe I don't have it, and God isn't just kind of a projection of everything I want God to be. God likes what I like. Well, I want to hit a second default setting I believe we fight, and I've mentioned this one before, and that is, especially like in crisis or not doing well, that God needs to be Mr. Fix-It. That, if I have something wrong, that God should fix that in my life. You ever do this? Especially when there's a crisis, someone's really sick, you got a financial problem, it's just not going away, you're in conflict. God, you need to fix this thing. God is Mr. Fix-It. And I don't know if you looked at your own personal history around that and your prayers around that or the history of the world around that, but pretty quickly you come to the conclusion that doesn't work out. There's consequences for that not working out. We get frustrated with God. You haven't fixed it. And like, well, God, then, I think it's a big issue for a lot of people with their relationship with God in our country today. Well, if God isn't going to fix it, God must not exist or care or something. God is Mr. Fix-It. And if you step back from both of those kinds of kind of default settings, the thing you notice about them, they're pretty self-centered. They're about me, God should like what I like, and God should do what I want God to do. That's a pretty self-centered way to kind of frame God. And I understand that we're people who can't see God. We're walking by faith. God doesn't show up before me, so I can't, pick up on all that kind of stuff. It's hard that way. Which is why we turn to the Word. That God might continue to guide us who have these default settings, who struggle against those sorts of things, and look at His Word. The next months we're going to be looking at John's Gospel. The day we had the beginning of that, of course, that's how it begins. John's Gospel begins, in the beginning was the Word. The Word. Capitalized Word. So you get a sense it's like a name of somebody. A name, but yet it's a defining name. It's a word that came into the world in the beginning, this person. And it said in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. In fact, the Word was God. The God can be called a word in the beginning. And you read a little bit more, and you find out this word is what's creating things. And what it creates is life. It creates life. And life, even the Greeks knew this, is more than biological life. They had the word bios for biological life. This is the word zoe. It's a broad term for life. So I think it's not only biological life, but soul life, relational life, that in the beginning God is creating and wanting this life. That life, so the way I phrase it is this word, that God is a life-giving word. It's pretty wild. A life-giving word. That's who God is. So when you look around and you see what's life-giving, we know that's God at work in every life-giving thing. That's the force of God in the world, to give life. Well, we certainly could say, well, birth, that fits that. Surely, birth, yeah, I like that one. Well, isn't food life-giving? And food in community, I think, is particular life-giving. And food when we're really hungry or someone else is really hungry is really life-giving. It saves their life. And I think the healing that comes up in our bodies and in our souls that just wants to fight for us to be well, and the people who support that, isn't that life-giving? And wait a second. Isn't it life-giving when we, feeling judged and bad about ourselves? And we hear that God created us, and it was very good. Life-giving. And then when we blow it and we have all these stuff that keeps getting thrown in our face from our own flaws and failings, that there's mercy and forgiveness for that. Life-giving. And when we're lost and can't find our way, that we have a voice or a direction. It's life-giving. When we have a purpose that we feel like is more than just this world that passes under us, it's life-giving. That this word, it's at work. It was from the beginning to give life both to our bodies, our souls, and our relationships that we have in this world. That it's just this force that just keeps coming and coming. This word is life-giving. And yet you're struggling a little bit with that. It's kind of hard to get your head around. Anybody get there? It's like, well, okay, Pastor, I get you. You got a little energy, and you're working it pretty good, but it's still a little abstract, isn't it? That God is this way. It's still, not there. And besides, when that works out in this world, it's a mess, isn't it? I mean, you say, well, life-giving when there's forgiveness, but has God been in a situation like I've been in? Did you see what they did to me over there? Has God met this person that I met? How is that going to, this doesn't work out very good. How is that like, how do we know what's going to be life-giving in this world? I mean, it's a mess. It's complex, and a lot of different things happen out there. What's going to be life-giving? So wouldn't it be cool if a word became flesh and dwelt among us? Life-giving, full of grace and truth. And can you imagine? So let's say that word shows up at a local wedding. Now, wouldn't it be fun to see what happens there at that local wedding? Or maybe, what would God do, this life-giving word do, if he met a low-life foreigner out there by a well? Oh, that's not. Imagine this life-giving word having to deal with one of those leaders. You know the kind we're talking about. Had to get cornered by one of our leaders. How would that work out? Maybe at night. Or what about that lame guy who's been begging down by the pool? What would life-giving look like there? Or the blind man beside the road? What would it, we're dancing around it. What would it look like for that life-giving force to have a loved one die? There, that would show it up, wouldn't it? Well, what would happen if a good friend of his died and he had to deal with that? Oh, we're still a step off it all. What would the life-giving force have to have happen when all the world turns against him? Then they betray him. They throw him out, because that stuff happens. And then they falsely accuse him, and then they try him and hold him guilty anyway. And he has to suffer horribly. Because that happens here. It does. To all of us. What would life-giving look like right there? And he dies. Well, I hope you're curious. Because that's what we're waiting for. For God to show us what life-giving word, full of grace and truth, looks like in this world. So we might have a clue. For the word is going to be made flesh and dwell among you, full of grace and truth. That's what's happening. It's coming. This word is going to be made flesh. Life-giving word, full of grace and truth. To in your eyes.